Here we go. I wanted you all to see my latest grandbaby. So this is Ivy James Lapine, who was born on St. Patrick's Day, and my son reports that she is about the size of that dog's head. The dog is a 100-pound dog. And what kind of a dog is? Do you remember what kind? It's not an Akita, is it? Maybe. Okay. It's a big white dog, is all I know. And that baby's about the size of the dog's head, so I wanted you to see that. And you can turn the lights back on. And my daughter sent me a text during church that while she was brunching today, Kiera Knightley came up, and Kiera had her baby, and Katie had her baby, so they got a chance to talk over brunch. So are you impressed? Yeah. Yeah. Kiera Knightley. There you go. All right. I think we've got everybody migrating over from the other side and coming in. Here's what we're going to do. Like I said, we don't want to rush through this because we want to answer any questions anybody's got, and we want to talk through whatever anybody wants to talk through. But we want to give you an update on how we're doing financially. We want to give you an update on where we are in terms of the building, where we are in terms of a hire, and just kind of what's going on church-wise and where our focus is. So because I'm good with words and not numbers, I'm going to turn things over to Tim Friesen, who is chairman of our elders, and he's going to tell you kind of where we are financially. All right?
Test. Okay, we're good. Good afternoon. Hope everybody had enough lunch, and we'll try to get you through this and get out of here in a hurry so you can get your naps in. I have good news, I think all good news on the financial side, which is always encouraging. Grant, you want to go ahead and put that first slide up? First thing we wanted to do is let you know where we are financially. With regard to cash position, value of the land, construction, and total assets. One of the obvious questions there is, what do you mean construction? I didn't think we had started. We have and we haven't, so to speak. We haven't actually broken ground and begun the construction process, but according to proper accounting procedures, based on Laura White and her excellent understanding of the accounting world, when you pay an architect, that becomes part of the building. That actually becomes part of your assets toward the building and actually becomes part of that, so you actually treat that as an asset. So that's the reason you see that there. There's about $111,000 that we put toward the building through the architects and getting all the drawings together and getting it bid out and that kind of thing. So that's that. Now I have time for questions here at the end. Next thing we want to look at is expenses, is our budget. How are we doing in terms of managing our expenses versus a budget? Each year we set up an annual budget, and that'll just give you an idea from operating expenses, missions, and ministry expenses, those three categories. So basically, if you look at it in a big picture, we've got a budget of a couple $100,000. You turn me down just a little bit. A couple $100,000 and and then the amount of expense against that was a little bit under that. That's what it costs basically to do church here each year. And that has been fairly consistent for the number of years now, those numbers. With regard to foreign missions, we want to show you what we're planning to do next year, actually this year, with regard to foreign missions. $60,500 there, and Keith and Ruth Ann Wells in Italy, Little Door International, Charles and Julie Woodrow in Mozambique, Kirk and Jennifer Perret in China, and then John and Janelle in Uganda. Local outreach, our plan is to distribute $10,200, and that ministry selection yet to be determined. Next slide, 5-year giving trend. How much have you generously given to our work here and across the sea? You can see a good trend there from 311 in 2011 to the last 2 years, slightly over $450,000. So as we plan for the future, what we're doing is we've developed actually a cash flow analysis worksheet where we look at, can we afford to build? And if we built and brought somebody on staff, can we afford to do that? So we built a cash flow analysis worksheet that shows, based on our historical giving trends, can we do that? And the answer is yes, but it's going to be fairly tight. And what we've done in building that is we've taken the last 2 years and averaged them, but in an effort to be, as some would say, ultra-conservative, we've actually knocked off $50,000 on each of those years to look at about $400,000 a year in giving. And can we afford the note, and could we afford to bring somebody on, and we can make that work? So I'm sure that's probably one question you would have, an appropriate one. New project costs. This can change from time to time, but right now it looks like our costs would be right around 2.6 million. We would need, if we want to borrow 1.7 million, we would need 900,000. You go back to the original slide, the very first slide, you'll see right now we have about 600,000 toward that. So a little math says we need 300,000. We actually need a little more than that because 50,000 of that 600,000 given is going to be reserved for our first hire to cover them for several months when they come on, so as not to be a burden to us from a cash flow perspective. And we'd want to keep about $50,000 in operating cash, just to go month to month. You don't want to start out with zero. You've got to have something to operate by. Then the anticipated monthly payment on that 1.7 million would be about 11,000 or slightly ahead, slightly over 11,000 a month. So, questions? Yes, Eric.
What's our current amount for rental here?
Current amount for rental here, I believe, is $3,522 a month. Got a great deal. So it's a very low cost. And when we move, of course, that we won't be incurring that cost, so that goes toward that cash flow analysis to see whether we can afford all the things that we're wanting to do. Other questions? Yeah, Carl.
What sort of salary are you talking about for hiring someone on?
What's that?
What sort of salary are we discussing for hiring someone?
That would vary depending on experience. What amount are we talking about? What range are we talking about in terms of bringing somebody on? What kind of salary? And that would vary depending on their experience, education experience, that kind of thing, much as it is in the normal job market. But we're probably looking between 50 and 65 for a salary, and we're planning not to get into providing an HR benefit package. So they would need to get their own health care and coverage. We'd rather not get in, especially with one employee, we'd rather not get into providing all those benefits because then you're a lot less flexible when you bring others on down the road. So what we'd like to do is pay enough of a salary so that they can cover their own. And some of you are looking at me going, that sounds like a pretty healthy salary. Some of you are looking at me going, how in the world are you going to live on that? And then they have to provide their own medical care. Well, whether you like it or not, thanks to the government, there are some very, very low costs of getting health care when you're making, especially when you're a family, making 50 to 55, 60,000 a year. So obviously they would take advantage of that. Other questions? Giving toward one of the, yes, Michael.
What are some of the local missions you're considering of giving to?
One of the question is, what local missions are you looking at contributing toward? Let me just tell you, Michael, from in the past, we've given to STEP, we've given to Union Rescue Mission, we've given to IFO, and Orchard Ministries. I think that's about it. And what we did, I think in our last meeting, we said, let's kind of rethink everything, not necessarily make changes, but why don't we secure input from the congregation in terms of what ministries are they involved in that they really believe in and think would be worthy of contributions from Redeemer. So the plan is, if you looked in your newsletter from last Wednesday, just look at that and see, are there local ministries I'm involved in? And would I like to make the case for the church also contributing toward that? So we're open to that. We want to hear from you on that, and then we'll make a decision regarding 2016. Other questions? Yes.
The church already outright owns the property, right?
It does. The question is, does the church own the property outright? And the answer is yes. 20 acres. It was platted, I guess, for 80 homes. It's a beautiful piece. Well, many of you have been there. You know it's a beautiful piece. We bought it for $392,000, or right at $392,000. We believe it's worth significantly more, but the right thing, I think, to put on the assets are what we paid for, not speculate, because it's not for sale, right? But we think that we got it at a fair price. In fact, maybe a little, favored us perhaps a bit. Other questions? Yes, Cindy.
What is the timeline? One, that's one question. And two, the liquid cash that y'all have, is that earning any interest on it?
A little tiny bit, like when the question is, the two questions, what interest are you earning on the money that you have in the bank? And Cindy, excuse me, what was the other one? The timeline. Bob will give the timeline in terms of what we're thinking of and why we're delayed on this, okay? And it's earning a tiny bit of interest, much like when you put money in the bank and you're wondering, 0.1%, really? And there are other places we could go, but there's some laws that since we're a charity organization, we can't go to the same places you would go in terms of earning interest on your money. So there's some restrictions there. So you don't earn a lot. We're earning a little bit, tiny bit. But it is safe. One of the things that we've done is we've made a decision that rather than speculate, even in a very quote, what we would consider to be very safe investment, we've chosen not to do that, but to have it, guaranteed by the bank. So we split that $600,000 up so that it's FDIC insured. We just don't want to put any of that at risk. Any other questions? All right, and I'm available. Any kind of detail you want to see, any concerns, you need to know what the church is doing. You need to feel comfortable about how the money is handled, and I'm happy to help in any of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We did put most of the money in Chipotle, and we've lost now all of.
Oh no.
Yeah. So pull up my slides if you would, and yeah, go ahead. Building plans are on pause. Okay, we had told you that we were in a window between the first of the year and February 29th, where had we been able to raise $150,000, we were going to pull back and look at that and say, okay, should we at this point borrow a little more money than we had anticipated and go ahead and go on this project? Became a moot point because we didn't raise $150,000. So here's what we've done. This is, by the way, if you haven't seen the color picture of the new building out front, you can look at that up above the sign. It looks really nice, but this is what we want to build someday. Front door in the middle, worship center over here, education wing over on that side. Many of you have seen the blueprints and what we're hoping to build. So this is what we're aiming for at one point. Go ahead, next. Next. So you've seen the map. Here's the worship center that would hold about 350 to 400 people by the time it's finished out. Here's the lobby with the kitchen and with the bathrooms, with the big living room area and a patio that's out back there. And then the education wing over here. That's about roughly 16,000 square feet. That is our plan and our hope to build. And as we have been trying to look at, is now the right time? Do we have the money? Could we move forward with this project? One of the things that we talked to you about recently was the opportunity to look at that back part. Go ahead, the next slide. Look at that next one. Look at that back part of the education wing, and maybe if we cut it off, we could get to where we wanted to go. So the next slide shows the education wing, and what we wanted to cut off is on the next slide. So we were just looking at reducing that. Thought if we reduce the square footage by about 2,000 to 3,000 square feet, could we save enough money that we could then go ahead and build? Now go back to that one I took you past real fast with the numbers on it. So, no, back. You went forward. There, we're back. Yeah, so here's a summary of what Tim showed you. The land costs $390,000. Construction and improvements, $2.6 million. Total project's about a $3 million project, okay? When we set out to do this, and we were looking at building 16,000 square feet, our estimate was that you could build that building for about 1.8, okay? So we got into it and said, oh, it's going to be a lot more. It's going to be 2.6 instead of 1.8. Actually, they came back and they said, no, it's going to be 2.9. And we valued engineered some stuff out to get it down to 2.6, and that's about as far as we felt like we could go. So we said, well, what would happen if we took out those 3,000 square feet in the education wing? Now zip forward for me a bit. So the total given to date is $950,000 roughly. That includes the $390 that's been given for the land, and that includes the $600,000 that we've got minus the $50,000. It's got about we got about $550 in the bank for the land. Construction loan would be 1.7, as Tim said. So our funding gap is about $300,000 to $350,000. Okay, next one. So options explored. Option number one is we could borrow more money. Total available was 1.9. Instead of 1.7, let's borrow 1.9. We're a lot closer. That would have meant a higher monthly payment, and we still would have been $150,000 short to break ground. So we said, we're not go back. We said we're not comfortable with the higher payment on a monthly basis. That makes us a little uneasy, and we don't have the 150 there anyway. So then we said, well, what about building less? What if we cut the space from that education wing? Well, we got into that. Go ahead, next one. And yeah, so this takes you through. Go ahead, and we've done that. So we looked at that. The build less, we'd hoped this option might save us $200,000. We talked to the builder, and the builder said, no, it'll save you about 120. And then we said, well, if we save 120 now and we want to go back and build it later, what's it going to cost us to build later? And they said about 350. So we said, we'd like to save 350 and have it cost us 120 later. They said that doesn't work that way. So at that point, when we said, we don't think we should borrow more, it still doesn't get us there. We don't think we should build less, especially if the numbers look like this. So that's where, go to the next slide, that's where we made the decision, pause the building plans, continue fundraising, reevaluate in 6 months or as soon as additional funding is possible. So in terms of a timeline, we're in kind of a pause, a wait and see. Now, pretty much every year over the last 3 or 4 years, every year we have operated with somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 plus revenue at the end of the year. So between what you give and what we spend, there's about $200,000 left over. That's why we've got $550 in the bank to go toward buying. That's why we own a piece of land, because over the course of time, the surplus of what you've given has enabled us to buy the land and to put money aside for building. And as Tim showed you, we're operating the church for about $200,000 a year, and about on that $200,000 that we're operating, that includes somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 going to missions every year. Over the life of the church, we've done a quick estimate. We've given about $500,000 to missions, some local, much overseas. And honestly, nobody wants to pull back on doing that. We want to continue with that as a commitment. If we pulled back on doing that, we could build. Okay? But we've just said, no, we're not comfortable saying, let's build ourselves a building and let the people in Myanmar fend for themselves. So we've got we've got stuff on hold. If this year was like last year and we get to the end of this year, we will have raised another $200,000 for the building in terms of surplus. If the giving stays the same and the expenses stay the same at the end of the year, we'll have about another $200,000. Well, we're about $350 short. So if there was no additional extraordinary giving, our timeline would mean we'd be ready to break ground in about a year and a half, a year and 3/4. And we figure it's going to take a year to build. So that puts us about 3 years out on a normal timeline before we could be in a new building. Which is, if that's God's timetable, we're good with God's timetable, right? Now, if somebody wants to accelerate it through extraordinary giving, through over and above giving, that just gets us that much closer. And we've had some extraordinary gifts. At the end of last year, we had a gift given that was $100,000 to the church, with 50 of it designated for the building, 50 for the first hire. At the end of this year, we saw an additional, I forget what the number was, but you remember 25, about 70,000 over and above monthly giving that was added to that. So we've seen that accelerate. That's when Tim talks about the conservative numbers, he's trying not to plan that we're going to get those kind of special big gifts at the end of every year. So those are how those numbers end up. If giving increases, now here's the wild card in all of that. Let's say it's a year and a half out and we got 350,000 in the bank. We go back to the builder and say, we're ready to build. And the builder says, oh, well, the prices have now gone up. The other wild card is you go back to the builder and he says, oh, it's a perfect time. Prices are down. You're going to get more for your money. We don't know. That's where we're just trusting it's in the Lord's hands. And if you know individuals or foundations who'd like to see a gospel-centered church planted in Little Rock in its own building, just send them my way. I'm happy to tell them our story. But based on where we are today, if we're on the normal trajectory, we would probably break ground at the beginning of 2018 and be in at the beginning of 2019. Okay? Questions about that? That it? Is that my last slide on this one? I think it is. Yeah. So that gets us to hiring plans. Anything about the building or about where we are? You know, I think for all of us, there's a we'd like to get there sooner. At least there is for me. I'd like to get there sooner. But that's where you do have to be content that God's in control, and getting there sooner just means that the king who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills needs to sell a few cows and send us some money. Okay.
Talk just a little bit about our considering a different type of building and our propensity early on to say we like something that fits the land.
Yeah. So as we've considered a variety of options, the church that we're looking at building is a site-built church. And one of the things we wanted to do architecturally was we wanted the look of the facility to fit the piece of land that we're on. And you've been out to that land, it looks like you're kind of, it's amazing to me how within 2 minutes it can feel like you've left Little Rock and you're out in the country, right? And then 2 minutes later you're back in Little Rock. It's just this, and I don't expect it's going to stay like that forever, but right now it's that kind of a beautiful rural landscape. We thought we'd like it to look like something between a horse farm and a hunting lodge that's on that land. You know, we'd like it to have that look that's kind of rustic, that's kind of, that fits the property, because honestly, we could go throw up a metal building that would be a warehouse style building on there for less money than we're talking about doing it. There are a number of reasons why we don't think that's a good move. It would get us in a lot quicker, and we could pull the trigger on that today. And some metal buildings can look really nice. There are a lot of churches that you've been to that you didn't know they were metal buildings, but they are. But at the end of the day, the construction costs are not that much lower. You would not get the ceiling height we're hoping to have. You wouldn't get the natural lighting that we're hoping to have with a metal building. There are a lot of different factors that aesthetically we're kind of holding out for at this point, because we think it'll give us a better long-term experience in where we are. And we want people driving by to look at it off to the left or off to the right as they're driving by and go, that's pretty. Not that we want them to go, gee, aren't those nice people who build a pretty building? It's not pretty for the sake of pretty, but we'd like them to think that's attractive and a place I'd like to go to, a place I'd feel comfortable driving into and going to. And of course, keeping in mind, we're not just building a building, we're building a parking lot, we're doing landscape architecture, we're doing plumbing, we're doing all kinds of road grading, and so there's more to this project than just what your building looks like. Other questions about where we are building-wise? Okay, let's talk about the new hire. In terms of those plans, we're continuing. Most of you know that we have been for about a year actively engaged with a number of people who some have expressed interest in us, some we've expressed interest in them. We've had ongoing dialogue. Over the summer, we brought a couple in who we we spent time with, and ultimately they determined that God was calling them to Texas. And then back last month, we had another couple come in, and they've ultimately landed in Louisville, Kentucky, doing a non-ministry job as they kind of recoup from some of what they've gone through. Both great couples, and both couples that we felt good about, but again, God closed the door on those. We're in dialogue with folks right now as we continue this process. So go ahead. We're looking for somebody who can help us with the shepherding and administrative load that we've got. Now, let me just say, Kathy Kroll has come on, as most of you know, on a part-time basis, and she is helping us a ton with the administrative load. We're in we're in significantly better administrative shape than we've ever been as a church, just because she's getting stuff organized and in order that we just didn't have time and capacity to organize, and order. So we're grateful for that. But when I talk about additional administrative load, there are things that that go beyond what Kathy would do. So, for example, if we wanted to have a square dance in here, and I know some of you are going, yeah, let's do it. So if we wanted to do that, there would just be administrative work that would involve like moving the chairs, or would involve getting the room ready, or Kathy can do some of those things in terms of decoration, but we don't want her doing a lot of manual labor around that kind of stuff. But if we had a first hire, we can say to that first hire, that's part of what we want you to do. Or for example, let's say that we wanted to do a family-oriented or a youth-based missions trip. We'd like somebody who can put a project like that on his back and make it happen. Or if we wanted to do a VBS, we'd like somebody who can take that on and make all of that happen. So that's when I'm talking about shepherding and administrative, that's what I'm talking about. Help shape and lead children's ministry, student ministry, men's ministry, assimilation ministry, and our digital and online ministry. Those are kind of the 5 things that we've identified that we've said we really feel like we need some help in doing a better job in children's ministry, in doing a better job with student ministries, in expanding what we're doing with men's ministry. Assimilation is that ministry that we got from the time somebody shows up. By the way, let me just say, when somebody shows up at church here, you all do a really good job of making a first-time guest feel welcome and feel loved, and that's a great thing. From that to somebody feeling plugged in, part of a small group, I'm interested in membership classes. There's a gap there, and we're trying to fill in that gap, and we're looking for somebody who can help us make that happen, okay? And then online and digital ministry, we have a lot of opportunity in the digital space, both on our website, through Facebook and social media, for the ministry of Redeemer to expand, not just to people who are a part of our church, but to people who are outside of our church. There's just lots of opportunity for ministry engagement in the digital space. I don't have the specific numbers, but things as simple as our worship service being live streamed, our audio being downloaded. I know there are people who are listening all over the world to sermons that are coming out of here. How do I know that? Because you can tell where Google Analytics can tell you where the downloads are coming from. So when I see Europe, I think, well, that's probably Ken Wells who downloaded that one. That may be it, but that's still ministry to the Wells family, right? So is there more opportunity for stuff like that? We think there is opportunity to expand in the digital and in the social media space. We just need somebody who can help oversee and make that happen. And we're looking for somebody who can serve as part of the preaching team. That's not a requirement, but we'd like to have somebody who is gifted or skilled who can share more of the preaching load than is currently shared, okay? So, next slide. Where we are, we've met with 2 candidates who ultimately went elsewhere, ongoing discussion with potential candidates, and we're trusting God to bring the right person at the right time. When I go to Louisville here in a few weeks for the Together for the Gospel conference, I'm going to have printed up just a thing that says, here's what we're looking for at Redeemer for our first hire. And as I run into folks over there who may know folks, I'm spreading the word and talking to people I know who are in networks and saying, do you know anybody who might be interested in this? And it's just how we're getting the word out, through word of mouth. We're not hiring a search firm, and we're not putting ads up everywhere. And honestly, we're not anxious about this getting resolved. We're just trusting the Lord. We're trying to be less than passive, but more than aggressive, okay? So trying to find that perfect balance between, we don't want to be passive or passive aggressive. We don't want to be that either. We want to be somewhere right in the middle, Okay. So the next slide. In the meantime, God continues to be at work. And let me just say, as we get to this, when I ask the question, is God at work at Redeemer? I come back to 5 ways that I try to diagnose that. Here are my 5 diagnoses on how are things going at Redeemer. If you've been through Starting Point, it's back to what we talk about in Starting Point. The first thing is I ask the question, are we handling the word well in a way that people can understand it and access it and they're growing spiritually? Is God's word being preached effectively? And you tell us that it is. And so we've got good feedback on that. And that's something that as I look at it, I go, I'm grateful to God for how he's at work through the ministry of his word in this place. Not just on Sunday morning, but what's going on through the women's ministry, what's going on in small groups. I think God's word is being handled well here. And I think it's having an impact in people's lives. So that's the first thing I look at. Second thing I look at is, are we worshiping well? And I don't just mean are we singing loud when it's time to sing, but I mean do our lives display a quality of life that is a worship, a life of worship? Are we people who are expressing our love for Jesus and our love for the gospel in a way that is that's good and engaging and healthy? I don't want us to be people who are shy about that, and I don't want us to be people who are show-offs about that. But I want us to be people who are engaged, heart, soul, mind, and strength, in expressing our love for Jesus. So how are we doing in that area? Again, you tell us that we're doing well. There's still opportunity for growth in that area, and that's things that we're trying to calibrate around and figure out what can we do to promote a more active, vibrant, worshiping community. And that's the third thing I'm looking for. The third thing is, how are we doing at community? Are we loving one another? What I wrote about in the newsletter this week, the one another's of Scripture, is that happening? And one of the things that tells me that that's happening well is that our small group ministries continue to be well attended. And I'm hearing good reports out of the small groups that the needs, the spiritual needs of different people are being met in the context of those small groups. That's where we hope it happens. That's what I'm hearing is happening. We want to see that continue and dwell and excel. Let me just say that this is an area that when folks who are first timers to the church or new to the church, when they give us feedback, one of the things that is most attractive about Redeemer is the way people love one another in this church. It's a standout thing that marks us as a church, and that's really a credit to how you are stepping past your own protective comfort zones to engage in the lives of others, and we pray that that will increase. So that's the third thing. How's the word doing? How are we doing as worshipers? How's our community look? The fourth thing is, how are we doing in terms of the mission of the church? How are we doing in terms of evangelism and discipleship, not just inside the church but outside the church? We've said we think that's a weakness here. It's not that nothing's happening. Money's being given. Mission trips are being talked about. There's been active involvement, and a lot is happening one-on-one that we get anecdotal stories where somebody will say, yeah, I took my friend out to lunch the other day and she doesn't know Christ and I'm doing this, or somebody else is working with international students. There's a lot happening one-on-one that we're just not sharing those stories necessarily, but it is happening. But we'd like to see that amped up. We'd like to see us become more missionally engaged, more evangelistically oriented. One of the projects we're working on right now is our book of your testimonies that we think can be a tool for how we share our faith, and that work continues as we edit the writing that was turned in back at the end of January. So how are we doing with the word, worship? How are we doing with community? How are we doing with mission, outreach, discipleship? And then the last thing that I calibrate is, are Jesus and the gospel at the center of everything we're doing? Is that why we're doing what we're doing? And could people come and spend time with us and miss Jesus and the gospel? Okay? And I look at that and go, that's at the end of the day, that's the ultimate measure. Everything else happens because of that. The reason we want to dig deeper into God's word is because it helps us know more about Jesus and understand the gospel better. The reason that we want to worship well is because that's how you respond to the gospel. The reason we want to be in community is because the gospel is to be lived out in community. The reason we want to be on mission is because that's what God's called us to in terms of advancing the gospel. It's all about Jesus and the gospel. And at the end of the day, if somebody could be at our church and go through a service at our church or be around you very often and not walk away going, you guys are really all about Jesus and the gospel, aren't you? Then we've not made it clear. That's what we're fighting to keep as the centerpiece of all that we're doing. And so that's going to continue. Whatever happens with a hire, whatever happens with a building, with the land, that's what's going to be at the center of all we do. And I just thought I'd wrap this up by sharing with you. I have an area above the dryer. It's not even a file. It's just where I stuff stuff. There's some shelves above the dryer, and there's this little corner where I just put notes over the years, because some of you have sent thank you notes, some of you have sent cards at different times, or just written notes of encouragement, and I just put them up there, and from time to time I'll get them down and just remind myself that God's at work here, right, through reading what people have shared. And if you were to go to that, you'd see comments that look like this. Somebody wrote and said, "Thank you and all the elders for your prayerful guidance in leading a Christ-centered, word-rich, and spirit-led journey for a hungry community of believers. I'm amazed at God's grace, and I'm deeply grateful." Now, what that tells me is that God's at work through our church. Somebody else wrote and said, "I'm excited about the church. I pray daily for the church. It's obvious to me and others that the Lord has great plans for the future." Somebody else wrote and said, "I've been challenged, encouraged, and convicted over the last 15 months. I'm grateful for our church." Somebody else said, "We're thankful to be here. God's using Redeemer to bring the lessons home to us. The sermons have been exactly what we've needed." Somebody else said, "The Lord is using you to ease some of our suffering at this time. Thank you for the compassion and blessings. Because of this ministry, I've found a place to belong, to serve, and to truly worship. It's been such a joy to see others using their gifts. I feel like I've left a desert and entered an oasis." And somebody who said, "I found that RCC does a wonderful job of welcoming, which I know is not accidental. I really love seeing this, as I believe this is what the body should be." So I just copied a handful of those comments to say, even when you're meeting above the revenue office in rental space with no full-time staff, God can still work through that, right? And it's happening. And at the end of the day, that's how we measure what's going on here. And that's what we get excited about. And that's why we do what we do. And so we're going to keep doing what we're doing, because if this keeps happening, we'll keep doing what we're doing so this keeps happening. And we'll trust the Lord to provide the building and the staff when his timing comes on that. And of course, there's a lot still coming up. We've got a men's retreat next month. We've got Don Whitney, who's going to be with us over the summer. We're starting to make plans for the fall, for women's ministry in the fall, and what we're going to do around that. And we just continue to look at what's the most effective way to have ministry happening here so that people will grow deeper in their own personal walk with Christ, deeper in community, and so that they'll begin to do more and more in terms of outreach and discipleship. Questions about all of that? That kind of wraps up what I got from a presentation standpoint. So now's the time to ask questions, or go home and start watching basketball, or take a nap. Your choice. Who's got a question?
Back to the new hire, we had a list of all the responsibilities that we'd like them to do. Has there been any feedback? Have you been reaching out to people that's in line what they're looking for, that's more or less than what they would expect to do?
Yeah, so Kendall says in regard to the new hire, we've got a bunch of stuff listed, and our people looking at that and going, "Wait, you want me to do all of that?" Right? Which I could understand somebody looking and saying that. What we are looking for really is somebody in a church this size. You're looking for somebody who can put their shoulder against a number of different things. If we were a larger church, you'd hire a youth guy who's doing only youth, right? But in a church this size, you're looking for somebody who has to be a utility infielder and play the outfield some and catch and maybe pitch. Okay, so people who know small churches know that that somebody has got to be able to do multiple things. Now, what they typically will say is somebody will say, that's what I'd really like to, the children and youth or the preaching or the this, that's kind of the sweet spot for me. I can do some of those other things, but this is the sweet spot for me. That's the kind of person that we're looking for, is not somebody who would say, yeah, I can do all of that, because it's wildly dissimilar. We're looking for somebody, and they're going to tell us, they're going to say, I have experience in this area. I don't have experience in that area, but I'm willing to help out in that area. And so which of those 5 things, remember I listed 5 things: children, youth, men's, assimilation, and digital and online. Which of those 5 things is most important? I'll tell you, when I find the guy who would say, I can do a couple of those, whatever, if he's the right guy and he's got a couple of those, those are the most important ones at that point, right? So we recognize that all of them are important, and we're trusting God to direct where we put our focus based on who he brings us related to that. Yes, Eric.
How's the publishing project doing on,
The publishing project. The publishing project is in the editing phase, and we have volunteer editors, and they have limited time, and so it's slow. And we're going to see what we can do about speeding it up. What else? Okay, there's nothing else. Then I'm going to pray, get us out of here, and you're going to help clean up before. Yes, Glenn. Yeah, help us clean and remove, and before you leave, do some work, okay? That's how it works at a non-staff church. If we had a hire, we'd just tell him to fix it all. We'd go home? No, we wouldn't. Let me pray. Father, we do love you. We thank you for how you are at work in our midst. We thank you for your grace, how it is being poured out on us, and how it's being poured out through us into the lives of others. And I pray that we would see that increase in the days ahead. Thank you for the work of your Spirit in this place. Thank you for all of these friends, these people, these loved ones, and thank you for knitting our hearts together around Jesus and the gospel. I don't know that we'd be friends if it weren't for that, and because of that, we're great friends. And so we thank you for the commonality of the gospel and for your work in our lives as a result of it. Lord, we pray that you would continue to direct our steps through providence, through bringing us the right person at the right time, through providing us with the funds we need at the right time, and through making this ministry possible in this community by your hand. We really are dependent on you. We want to acknowledge that dependence, and we want to stay dependent. We don't want to be like the rich fool that we talked about this morning, who forgets how dependent he is. So direct our steps, and we look to you, and we trust you, and we love you. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for staying. Help clean up, and we'll see you next Sunday for Easter Sunday. Friday night for Good Friday at 7 o'clock, Friday night, 7 o'clock, and then Easter Sunday.